Before we advance to the next dispatch from the front, mark your approval with a sanctioned upvote, pledge continued service through subscription, and activate the hype protocol as decreed. Such small acts of compliance fuel the war effort. The Emperor does not forget loyalty.
Imagine a battlefield so hellish that it makes the trenches of ancient Terra's world wars look tame by comparison. On a barren, dust-choked world, countless lives are thrown into the meat grinder of war in the name of a god emperor who will never know their names. This is not a fever dream or a cautionary fable. This is real, and it happened in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Welcome to Vraks, an Imperial armory world turned charnel house, the site of one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in Imperial history. For 17 years, the forces of the Imperium battled traitors and heretics over this blasted rock. Trench warfare, artillery barrages that lasted for weeks, gas attacks, demon summonings, doomed cavalry charges across no man's land, and sacrifices beyond comprehension. Vraks had it all. The Siege of Vraks is a story of fanatical faith and unimaginable carnage, of heroes and villains, but mostly of pointless death on an industrial scale. Grab your rebreather and fix bayonets. We're diving into the full lore of the Siege of Vraks. Our tale begins with a man of the cloth who dramatically strayed from the Emperor's light. Cardinal-Astra Xaphan was his name, a high-ranking priest of the ecclesiarchy in the Scarus sector. By all accounts, Xaphan started as a pious and charismatic leader, but as often happens with those given a taste of power and a captive audience, something in him twisted. Over the course of 5 standard years, Xaphan went on an ambitious grand tour of his domain, preaching to the masses on every world he visited. He traveled with an entourage 1,000 strong, and his fiery sermons lit a spark among the beleaguered and downtrodden. On hive worlds and dusty colonies alike, desperate people flocked to him. To them, the Cardinal's words of hope and deliverance were a beacon in the darkness. Some even began to whisper that he was a living saint. Amid this growing cult of personality, Xaphan started to glimpse the true extent of his influence, and he liked it. Unfortunately for the Imperium, there was someone whispering into Xaphan's ear, encouraging his delusions of grandeur. This someone was Deacon Mammon, ostensibly one of Xaphan's trusted aides, but secretly a devotee of chaos. Mammon played the long game, flattering the Cardinal and stoking his ego. He convinced Xaphan that corruption and heresy were everywhere in the Imperium, and that only Xaphan, righteous and pure, could cleanse it. In Mammon's telling, any Imperial official who questioned the Cardinal's growing flock was a doubter or a heretic undermining the Emperor's divine rule. Xaphan began to see conspiracies and treachery all around. Paranoia and zeal make a dangerous mix. The Cardinal decided that the Emperor was calling him to wage a grand war of faith. But to launch such a crusade, he needed a base of operations far from prying eyes, a place where he could build an army of the faithful. The world of Vraks Prime fit the bill perfectly. Vraks was an armory world, essentially a giant munitions dump for the Astra Militarum, with millions of artillery shells, tanks, weapons, you name it, stored in its vast depots. It also had a large population of indentured laborers and a massive cathedral-like basilica dedicated to Saint Leonis the Blind. In other words, Vraks had guns, ammo, and plenty of unhappy, downtrodden workers who might rally to a fiery preacher promising a better future. Conveniently, Vraks was also off the beaten path, out near the Eye of Terror. If you were a scheming cardinal thinking of defying the Adeptus Ministerum's chain of command, Vraks would be a nice, secluded place to do it. By the time Xaphan arrived on Vraks, he had already planted seeds of fanaticism. His preachers and missionaries had quietly spread word among the labor gangs and pilgrims. A great change was coming, a holy mission. The cardinal built himself a little inner circle of loyalists, the disciples of Xaphan, recruiting from the zealots who followed him from world to world. He even managed to sway key members of Vraks' PDF, Planetary Defense Force, and the local Imperial Guard garrison, Auxilia, to his side. The only people on Vraks not under Xaphan's charismatic spell were the Adeptus Arbites, Imperial law enforcement, and a small contingent of Adepta Sororitas, Battle Sisters, assigned to guard the Basilica. Those few stayed suspicious of the Cardinal's activities. Naturally, the Inquisition got wind that something was amiss. You don't get called a messiah by crowds and amass armed followers without triggering some red flags. The Ordo Hereticus, the branch of the Inquisition that deals with heresy within the Imperial Church, had seen this pattern before. An overambitious cleric who starts believing he's above the rules, so they decided to quietly remove Xaphan before he could spark the very rebellion they feared. How do you quietly remove a popular cardinal? With a vindictive assassin, of course. Specifically, they sent a Vindicar assassin, a professional sniper from the Officio Assassinorum, skilled in the art of one perfect kill. One cold morning on Vraks, that assassin took a shot at Cardinal Xaphan, aiming to end his budding rebellion with a single pull of the trigger. But fate, or perhaps the dark gods, intervened. Xaphan survived the attempt on his life. The only thing that saved him was his Rosarius, a holy amulet that projected a refractor field. In layman's terms, the cardinal was wearing a personal force field generator blessed by the church. Perks of being a high-ranking clergyman. The sniper's bullet, instead of blowing Xaphan's head off, was deflected at the last second with a crackle of energy. Xaphan was stunned but very much alive. If the Inquisition was hoping to prevent a rebellion, this was exactly the opposite of what they wanted. Imagine the scene. The Cardinal's followers see their beloved savior nearly murdered by an agent of the so-called righteous Imperial government. The news spreads like wildfire through the worker habs and trench cities of Vraks. The Imperium just tried to kill the one man who actually cares about us. It was the spark to the powder keg. Almost overnight, Vraks Prime erupted into open revolt. Cardinal Xaphan wasted no time seizing the moment. He framed the assassination attempt as ultimate proof that the High Lords and the corrupt Imperium wanted to silence the truth of his message. With righteous fury, he called the faithful to arms. The Cathedral of St. Leonis became the rallying point for a frenzied uprising. The Cardinal's fanatical Fraternis militia, basically mobs of zealots and ragged workers whipped into a religious frenzy, took to the streets alongside mutinous PDF soldiers and laborer gangs. They overwhelmed the scant planetary authorities in a tidal wave of sheer numbers. The Arbite's precinct house was stormed and the judges within butchered. The tiny detachment of Sororitas stationed at the Basilica fought with valor, but were eventually overrun or captured after a brutal last stand at the steps of the shrine. The Master Prefect, the administratum official in charge of Vraks' armory operations, was dragged into the street and lynched by the mob. In a matter of days, Cardinal Xaphan became the undisputed lord of Vraks Prime, styling himself as the leader of a righteous rebellion against doubters and heretics who supposedly infested the imperial hierarchy. It's worth noting the tragic irony here. Xaphan claimed to be acting to save the Emperor's realm from heretics, but in truth, he had become the very thing he professed to hate. Whether he fully realized it or not, he was now an apostate, a traitor to the Imperium. And thanks to Deacon Mamon's whispers, chaos had its claws sunk deep into this uprising from the start. The rebellion was framed as a populist, religious movement, But lurking behind the curtain were the powers of the warp, smiling at the delicious irony of turning the Emperor's faithful against his own government. With Vraks in rebel hands, Cardinal Xaphan fortified his position. He had the planet's entire arsenal at his disposal now, and it was an arsenal meant to supply armies. There were enough munitions on Vraks to wage a war for decades. Spoiler alert, that's exactly what will happen. Xaphan's followers looted the depots, arming tens of thousands of traitor guardsmen and militia. The Cardinal's most loyal fighters, many of them former PDF elites or fanatical zealots, formed an inner corps known as the Disciples of Xaphan. The bulk of his forces were the Vraksian Planetary Defense Force units that went turncoat, as well as hordes of Fraterni's militia, basically civilian zealots. Even the Labor Corps, the countless men and women who toiled in Vraks's factories and ammo dumps, were pressed into service as cannon fodder. These forces dug into the existing fortifications around the planet, preparing for the inevitable Imperial counterattack. And Vraks was well defended even before all this. Its landscape was dotted with bunkers, minefields, trench networks, and giant gun emplacements guarding approaches to the central citadel and the primary starport. The rebels now manned those defenses under the overall direction of Deacon Mammon, who became Xaphan's right-hand man in military matters. Mammon, ever the schemer, took charge of turning the revolt into a resilient fortress. He likely had some help from his unseen chaos friends in advising on defensive strategy, because the fortifications the rebels set up on Vraks would prove nightmarishly effective. It took a while for the wider Imperium to realize just how bad the situation on Vraks had gotten. Administratum bureaucracy moves slowly, and initial reports of unrest on an armory world in the middle of nowhere didn't get top priority. But soon enough, word reached the higher echelons that a cardinal had gone rogue and seized an entire planet's worth of weapons. That is not the sort of news you want to ignore. The potential damage from those stockpiles falling into enemy hands, or Emperor forbid, the hands of chaos, was catastrophic. If neighboring systems were armed with Vraks's arsenal and inspired by Xaphan's revolt, the rebellion could spread like wildfire. The Imperium needed to quash this, fast and hard. Thus, the wheels of Imperial retribution began to turn. The Adeptus Administratum and the Departamento Militarum, the military logistics division that ran Vraks, petitioned for a full-scale military response to retake the planet. This wasn't just a police action or a purge. Recapturing Vraks would require an army. So they formed one. The 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army was assembled, specifically tasked with Vraks. And they knew exactly what kind of soldiers would be needed for the job. Considering Vraks' formidable defenses and the likelihood of a prolonged trench war, they called upon the Death Korps of Krieg. Now, if you're not familiar with the Death Korps of Krieg, let's just say they have a certain reputation in the Imperium. These are not your average Imperial Guardsmen. Krieg regiments specialize in siege warfare and attrition fighting. They are notoriously grim, disciplined, and utterly unafraid of death. Actually, scratch that. They practically have a death wish, collectively. The Death Korps hail from a world that nuked itself into oblivion in a past rebellion, and ever since the survivors and their descendants live only to atone for that ancestral sin by sacrificing themselves in service to the Emperor. They fight in gas masks, long coats, and prefer trenches, bayonets, and massed artillery. If you need someone to storm a bunker or charge into machine gun fire without flinching, you call Krieg. The High Planners figured, correctly, that retaking Vraks was going to be a horrific grind. Who better to throw into a meat grinder than soldiers who don't mind being ground up? So, 31 regiments of the Death Korps of Krieg were assigned to the 88th Siege Army. That's hundreds of thousands of troops, plus their tanks, artillery, and support. Along with them came the usual complements: combat engineers, siege artillery companies, a few Imperial Navy fighter wings for air support, and Titans on standby. Yes, even god machines of the Adeptus Titanicus were earmarked in case really heavy firepower was needed. The plan was simple, on paper. Land overwhelming forces on Vraks, encircle the rebels, besiege them, and grind them down by attrition until the planet was back in Imperial hands. After all, the number crunchers estimated it would only take about 12 years and a certain acceptable number of millions of guardsmen lives to retake the world. When the Departamento Militarum uses the term acceptable losses, you better believe the number is astronomical. They see guardsmen as expendable resources, not people. Command of the 88th Siege Army went to Lord General Zwelka. Now, Zwelka was a man of pedigree, if not proven battlefield genius. A noble from Segmentum Solar with family connections high up in the Imperial Guard hierarchy. Let's be frank, he got the job largely because of politics. Sure, he'd read his Tactica Imperialis textbooks and had a martial upbringing, but he was no seasoned war hero. However, he had the trust of the brass, and presumably they figured that with enough Krieg troops and a healthy numerical advantage, even an average general could eventually overwhelm Vraks. So Zwelka set up his command post off-world on Thracian Primaris, a safe location in system to oversee the campaign via Vox and astropathic relay. This would allow him to coordinate the siege without putting his noble hide directly in a trench. Yes, he's commanding a siege from the comfort of a headquarters light years away. This will become relevant when things start going wrong. Thus, the stage was set. As 813 M41 rolled around on the calendar, the Imperium mustered its might to crush Cardinal Xaphan's rebellion. The loyal soldiers of Krieg, steel-eyed behind their skull-visor gas masks, made ready to descend on Vraks. In their hearts, or what passes for hearts in Krieg clones, they probably whispered a grim prayer, to die gloriously for the Emperor on some forsaken battlefield, as is their duty. They would get their wish, and then some. The Siege of Vraks was about to begin. The opening moves of the campaign were as unsubtle as expected. In late 813 M41, the 88th Siege Army arrived in the Vraks system and made planetfall. There was no attempt at negotiation or pleas for surrender. Those were long off the table. The Imperium's stance was clear. Vraks belonged to the Emperor, and they were here to take it back by force. The first Imperial troops to set foot on Vraks were the vanguard elements of the Death Corps. They landed via heavy dropships and transport landers in the desolate outskirts of the populated zones, aiming to secure beachheads. Picture thousands of gas-masked Krieg soldiers wordlessly disembarking amid blowing dust, setting up heavy weapons and trench works almost as soon as they touch ground. They encountered minimal resistance initially. The rebels were holed up behind their fortifications further inland, nearer the citadel and main depots. So the Krieg forces methodically established forward operating bases, landed their tanks and artillery, and prepared for the grind. Then came the grand overture, a massive artillery bombardment to announce the Imperium's presence. If Cardinal Xaphan somehow didn't notice the arrival of tens of thousands of guardsmen, he certainly noticed when the shells began to fall. The Death Corps had brought along an arsenal of big guns, everything from earth-shaker cannons to siege mortars known as bombards that lobbed huge shells capable of flattening bunkers. On the designated day, one of the siege, at the crack of dawn, the Imperial artillery opened up with a deafening roar. Hundreds of guns lit up the horizon. The sky turned black with smoke trails, and the ground trembled continuously. They targeted the outer defensive lines that the Vraxian traitors had prepared on the approaches to the citadel. Trench lines, forward bunkers, remote listening posts. artillery nests, anything and everything that looked like a defensive position out in the wasteland. This bombardment wasn't a brief prelude. It went on for hours, then days. Whole sectors of the Van Meersland wastes, the barren plains around the citadel, were churned into lunar landscapes of craters. The idea was to pound the enemy's outer defenses into dust before the infantry even moved. Of course, in war, things rarely go exactly to plan. The rebels had dug deep or built well in some areas, and many bunkers weathered the storm. Others were obliterated, sure, but an artillery barrage seldom kills everyone waiting underground. It does, however, announce your intentions. After several days of this relentless shelling, Lord General Zwilka, directing from orbit or off-world, ordered the first ground assault. It was 212,813 M41 by the Imperial dating system, when wave upon wave of Krieg infantry went over the top for the first time on Vraks. Approximately 500,000 men, yes, 500,000, charged across no man's land in that initial offensive, supported by hundreds of tanks rumbling forward and aircraft screaming overhead. They advanced behind a creeping barrage, a classic siege warfare tactic where artillery fire shifts forward slowly, staying just ahead of the advancing troops to keep the enemy's heads down. The scene was something straight out of nightmare or ancient history. Gray-coated soldiers with fixed bayonets, running and stumbling over cratered ground, lit by the flashes of explosions and tracer fire, all under a sickly orange sky filled with smoke. The defenders, traitor guardsmen and militia in their trench lines, unleashed a hail of fire as the attackers came within range. Heavy bolters, autocannons, las guns, mortars. The rebels threw everything they had into that storm of lead and laser. The result was carnage. Entire platoons of Krieg were scythed down in minutes, bodies piling in the blasted mud. But here's the thing about the Death Corps. They don't stop. A Krieg line infantryman will charge into machine gun fire until either he reaches the enemy or he's dead. Surrender or retreat aren't in their playbook. So despite obscene casualties, other Krieg soldiers just stepped over the fallen and pressed on. They crossed a no man's land littered not only with craters, but also mines and barbed wire. Mines blew off limbs. Wire entangled troops under fire. Casualties mounted by the second. Yet pockets of Krieg soldiers did reach portions of the rebel forward trenches. Brutal close-quarters fighting ensued, with grenades tossed into bunkers and bayonet thrusts, deciding matters in the gloom of trench dugouts. One by one, a few outermost entrenchments fell to these ferocious assaults, but the gains were minuscule compared to the cost. When this first massive attack finally petered out, the Krieg regiments had sustained tens of thousands of losses for only a negligible dent in the enemy's outer defenses. There were simply far more trenches and bunkers beyond the few they took, and the rebels were quick to counterattack any breaches. As the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared slightly on those initial assaults, it became evident that this siege was not going to be a quick victory. The first objective, to break the outer defensive ring, was not achieved in that opening gambit. The two sides essentially settled into a stalemate along the torn-up wasteland. In the weeks that followed the initial assault, life for the soldiers on Vraks devolved into a routine of trench warfare. Both the attackers and defenders dug in fervently. The Imperials linked and expanded the captured trench segments and dug new ones, inching forward sap by sap. The traitors, for their part, fell back to secondary trenches where pushed out, or even dug new lines behind the first. A maze of earthworks and wire began to spread across the face of Vraks's once empty plains. It was as if the planet sprouted scars of churned earth wherever men labored with shovels under fire. The war quickly became one of attrition, just as predicted. Only the timetable was optimistic. The Death Corps 88th Siege Army was losing around 2,000 soldiers a day on average, even during quiet periods, just from snipers, sporadic shelling, trench raids, disease, and accidents. But because these were Krieg troops, replacements were fed into the line daily to keep units at least somewhat functional. Morale, in the traditional sense, wasn't an issue for Krieg. They would hold their positions in stoic silence no matter how grim, though eventually even their numbers could run out if bled long enough. Picture the conditions. Ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, mud mixed with blood and promethium. The air a toxic mix of cordite, choking dust, and the never-ending thump of distant explosions. Every hour of every day somewhere along the front, artillery would thunder. The nights brought little relief. If anything, nights were when small units crept out into the shattered no-man's land to scout or to launch trench raids on enemy outposts. These raids were vicious close combat affairs, often yielding nothing but a handful of prisoners and a few dozen corpses as trophies for each side. And yet they continued, ordered by commanders to probe weaknesses or simply to remind the enemy that nowhere was safe. It was trench warfare in the purest, worst sense, a meat grinder where territory was measured in gains of a few hundred meters for thousands of lives. The first year of the siege ground on like this. By the end of that year, the outer defense lines had held against the first assaults, and both sides contented themselves with wearing each other down in a grinding stalemate of slow destruction. As year 2 dawned, the Imperial command was determined to make more substantial progress. A fresh offensive was planned to finally crack a significant strong point, a fortress known by the designation Fort A453. This bunker complex and fortification anchored a section of the rebel line. Taking it would, in theory, open a gap for Imperial forces to pour through. In mid-814 M41, after months of build-up and artillery preparation, the Battle of Fort A453 commenced. The Krieg 30th Line Corps was tasked with this assault, spearheaded by the elite grenadiers of the 261st Krieg Regiment under a commander named Colonel Tibork. These grenadiers were basically stormtrooper equivalents, better armor, hell guns, and generally used for the toughest assault missions. Following an earth-shaking preliminary bombardment, including a night barrage meant to terrorize and soften the defenders, Tibork's grenadiers went in under cover of smoke. They crossed no man's land in a determined rush, using the shell craters as cover where possible. Losses were still heavy. There's no magic bullet for crossing open ground under fire, but a contingent made it to Fort A453's edges. Fort A453 was a hardened position with trench works and underground shelters. The grenadiers had to fight trench to trench and then move into the subterranean corridors. Commander Tibork personally led men into the tunnels beneath the fort, engaging in brutal room-clearing fights in the dark with shotgun and shovel. At one point, as the story goes, Tibork's men were isolated, holding a small section of the fort's interior with enemies all around and above. He sent a runner back through the hell they'd just navigated. That poor soldier sprinted back for hours across shell-swept ground to report that they had a foothold inside Fort A453. Upon hearing this, the Krieg commanders threw in every reserve they could muster. More grenadier squads, then whole infantry companies, rushed into the breach to exploit it. On the surface, tank companies from Krieg's 11th Assault Corps revved up. Lehman Russ battle tanks and several Baneblade super heavy tanks, imagine metal behemoths bristling with cannons, advanced with covering fire, while combat engineer vehicles, like Atlas dozer tanks, filled in tank traps and craters to let the armor roll forward. After several days of sustained assault, the defenders at Fort A453 were overwhelmed. The Krieg troops cleared the tunnels one hab block at a time. and the fort's guns fell silent. Many of the traitor defenders fought to the death. Surrender wasn't common on Vraks on either side, given the fanatical nature of the war. Eventually, the Imperial flag, or the Krieg skull and helm insignia, more likely, was raised above the blasted ruins of the fort. Fort A453 was in Imperial hands. It had cost oceans of blood, but it was the first notable victory of the campaign, a crack in the armor of Vraks' outer line. And indeed, the fall of Fort A453 had a domino effect. The traitor forces, fearing encirclement, began to withdraw from some of their forward trenches adjacent to that fort. Whole sections of their outermost line suddenly became untenable and were abandoned. The Death Corps wasted no time exploiting this success. Additional corps pushed through the gap. The 8th Assault Corps, supported by swift Death Rider cavalry, Krieg's mounted soldiers on genetically engineered horses wearing gas masks. Yes, cavalry charges are not obsolete in 40,000 apparently, harried the retreating enemy, turning a disciplined withdrawal into a rout in some places. Within a short span, the entire rebel first defensive line, at least in that sector, had collapsed. The surviving rebels streamed back toward their secondary lines closer to the citadel. It was a hard-won breakthrough, but a breakthrough nonetheless. By late 814 M41, roughly 2 years into the siege, the Imperium had achieved its first major objective. The outer ring of defense in one sector had been breached and captured. A lesser commander might have grown complacent or confident at this point, but any smiles on Vraks were short-lived, because war has a way of swinging the pendulum back, and the rebels were about to launch a vicious counterblow to remind the Imperials that they weren't beaten yet. True to form, Cardinal Xaphan's forces, under Deacon Mamon's orchestration, were not going to take this loss quietly. The Imperials barely had time to consolidate their new gains beyond Fort A453 when the rebels counterattacked ferociously. In the northern sector of the battlefront, a portion of the line that had been relatively quiet suddenly erupted in violence. Under cover of darkness, traitor armored columns and massed infantry from the Vraksian PDF launched an all-out offensive aimed at the flanks of the newly won Imperial salient. It was a textbook riposte. Hit the enemy where they're overextended and least expecting it. Lord General Zwilki's battle plan had not anticipated such a bold move so soon from what he likely thought was a demoralized foe. The Krieg units holding that northern sector were caught off guard, and crucially, they had few reserves in position. So many regiments had been committed to the big push at Fort A453 that other parts of the line were threadbare. In the pre-dawn hours, waves of traitor guardsmen, supported by tanks, looted Lehman Russ tanks bearing spiky chaos icons scrawled on their hulls, crashed into Krieg forward outposts. The intensity of the assault forced the Imperials onto the back foot. Trenches that had been relatively calm for months were now scenes of panic and close combat. The Krieg soldiers, to their credit, fought stubbornly. They don't really panic in the traditional sense. Even surprised, they'll hold position until ordered to do otherwise or until they die. In this case, many did die holding on. By dawn, the rebels pressed the attack with renewed fury. They achieved multiple breakthroughs. In one area, they punched a hole clean through the first line corps of Krieg, effectively splitting Imperial lines. This was a crisis. If not contained, the entire newly won northern flank could collapse and possibly even endanger the siege army's rear areas and supply lines. Lord Commander Zwelka's grand timetable, which by now had them optimistically planning to push toward the citadel, was thrown into disarray by urgent pleas for reinforcement and stabilization of the front. Over 2 days of grueling, continuous battle, the northern sector essentially collapsed under the weight of the counter-offensive. Many Krieg companies were overrun or forced into fighting retreats, a rare action for Krieg, but better to yield ground and regroup than be annihilated in place when unassisted. Some units were effectively cut off and destroyed. The rebels retook a significant swathe of territory, including much of the area that had been gained around Fort A453's flank. The fort itself, luckily for the Imperium, did not fall back into enemy hands. The Krieg who had captured it dug in like ticks and refused to budge, enduring encirclement attempts and heavy shelling. But north of it, a lot of hard-won ground was lost. This counterstrike by the traitors delayed the Imperial campaign by a huge margin. What was supposed to be a tidy progression from outer defenses to inner defenses turned into a back-and-forth quagmire. Lord General Zwelke had to call off several planned offensives elsewhere to divert forces to contain the breach. Reserve regiments were redirected to plug the holes, and a seesaw of attacks and counterattacks played out over subsequent weeks. Eventually, after pouring in more tanks and launching desperate assaults of their own, the Death Corps managed to stall the rebel advance. Vicious tank battles took place on the cratered plains. Lehman Russ tank squadrons dueled with traitor Lehman Russes, and even a few heavy armor pieces the renegades rolled out of storage, including some ponderous super-heavy tanks that had been sitting in Vraks armories. Nothing like facing your own Baneblade that's now flying enemy colors. Each side's armored divisions slugged it out at point-blank range amidst burning wrecks. It was horrifically costly in machines and men, but by sheer grit, the Imperials halted the enemy thrust before it could break the siege entirely. With the immediate crisis contained, both sides effectively slumped back into their trench lines, exhausted. The front stabilized once more, but now in a more jumbled fashion. Some areas had changed hands multiple times, leaving the battlefield a patchwork of former Imperial trenches now held by traitors and vice versa. The net effect: 2 more years slid by without a decisive resolution. Offensives would be launched by the Imperium, yielding maybe a hill captured here or a bunker there, only for the traitors to retake it next month, or for the gain to prove strategically insignificant. This grim rhythm of advance and recoil repeated over and over. The casualty lists mounted, the war machines and ammunition stores dwindled, at least on the Imperial side, which had to bring munitions from off-world, whereas the rebels were still drawing from Vraks' deep reservoirs of ammo, though even those weren't infinite. By the time 820 M41 came around, the Siege of Vraks had dragged on for roughly 7 years. 7 years of hellish trench warfare, and the Imperium had still not even reached the formidable citadel or main bunker complexes in the inner defense ring. What had been envisioned as a 12-year campaign was now officially behind schedule, with the hardest fights likely yet to come. Lord General Zwelke must have been feeling the heat from his superiors over this slow progress, not to mention the grumbling from the Departamento Militarum about resources consumed. Little did anyone know the siege was about to enter an even bloodier phase, because at that point the war drew the attention of unsavory outside forces. The prolonged nature of the conflict, the bloodshed, the whiff of a high-ranking churchman's heresy, all this was like a shining beacon in the warp. Vraks had become a tantalizing prize for the Chaos Space Marines. In mid-82 M41, reports filtered into Imperial command that enemy fighters unlike the usual rabble had been encountered. Krieg sentries spoke in hushed tones of giant armored figures striking out of nowhere in the night, of sentry posts found massacred with smoking craters and bolt shell casings littered about. Initially, some Imperial officers refused to believe it. Chaos Space Marines here? Wouldn't that be just peachy? But it soon became undeniable. Wreckage of drop pods with the 8-pointed star of Chaos were found in the ash dunes, and survivors from one devastated outpost babbled about a fiend in green power armor who moved like a phantom and slew an entire squad in seconds. The Alpha Legion had arrived on Vraks. The Alpha Legion, for context, are a traitor marine legion known for stealth, sabotage, and generally making a nuisance of themselves from the shadows. They don't usually smash through the front door with guns blazing. They slither around the back and plant explosives in your pantry. That said, a Chaos Space Marine is a Chaos Space Marine. 8-foot-tall, gene-enhanced super soldiers in power armor are a terror in any form. Under the command of a warlord named Arcos the Faithless, a contingent of Alpha legionaries slipped onto Vraks, landing clandestinely on the far side of the planet with a small fleet. They likely had their own agenda, Alpha Legion always does, but broadly it aligned with aiding the Vraksian rebellion in sowing chaos against the Imperium. Arcos the Faithless was no two-bit champion. He was a seasoned Chaos Lord. He saw in Vraks an opportunity to run circles around the Loyalists. His forces, nicknamed the Faithless, quietly established a base on the opposite side of Vraks, beyond the immediate view of the main Imperial besiegers. From there, they began classic Alpha Legion warfare: infiltration, subterfuge, and lightning raids. They brought with them elite Chaos operatives, possibly even cult saboteurs that they seeded among Vraks' defenders to coordinate attacks. When news of Alpha Legion involvement reached Lord General Zwelka, he must have had a sinking feeling in his gut. He promptly relayed this up the chain of command, no doubt highlighting that this development was not in the original plan, to put it mildly. Traitor Marines on Vraks meant that an already grinding siege could escalate unpredictably. They could empower the rebels to take more offensive actions, or strike at high-value targets, like Imperial command assets or supply lines. As it turned out, just the rumor of Chaos Space Marines on Vraks was enough to spur some into action. Astartes action, to be precise. The Dark Angels chapter, one of the most famed Space Marine chapters, got involved, and they did so in a big way. Normally, Space Marines are not thrown piecemeal into drawn-out sieges. They're shock troops used for rapid, decisive strikes. And the Dark Angels in particular are known to be extremely selective in their campaigns, often acting only when it aligns with their own mysterious priorities. So eyebrows, figuratively, were raised when the Dark Angels offered a substantial force to help on Vraks. In fact, Supreme Grand Master Azrael himself mobilized half the chapter's companies for this undertaking. Why such enthusiasm from the usually aloof Dark Angels? They didn't exactly explain themselves to the Departamento Militarum, they never do, but one can speculate. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters, collectively known as the Unforgiven, have an obsession with hunting the Fallen, renegade Dark Angels from millennia past. It's possible they had intelligence that someone or something related to their secret hunt was on Vraks, perhaps hidden among Arcos' crew or elsewhere. Or maybe they just recognized that Chaos Space Marine involvement threatened to tip Vraks into a bigger Chaos foothold and decided to stamp it out. Either way, they came loaded for war. In 821 M41, the Dark Angels task force arrived in system and made a beeline for Vraks' starport. They requested, or rather declared, that they would execute a strike to recapture the starport and adjacent facilities from the rebels. Lord General Zwelka, probably both relieved to have Astartes' help and also slightly miffed at the commandeering of strategy, acquiesced. He pulled back Imperial forces around the starport vicinity to let the Space Marines do what they do best. The assault on Vraks' starport by the Dark Angels was swift and brutal. Before dawn, an intense orbital bombardment from their strike cruiser pounded the starport's outer perimeter. Then, Thunderhawk gunships screamed down through the atmosphere, guns blazing. They deployed squads of Dark Angels, power-armored angels of death in dark green livery, directly into the fray. Alongside them rumbled Land Raiders and Predator tanks brought via drop craft. Azrael himself led the charge, which shows how seriously they took this. The Astartes hit the traitors like a hammer. In the first hour, they overran perimeter defenses that the Guard hadn't breached in years. Dozens of traitor tanks were left burning, and hundreds of cultist militia were slain almost before they knew what hit them. The Space Marines pushed into the starport proper, sweeping through warehouses, hangars, and hab blocks with disciplined fury. Over 8 days, they fought block by block, systematically purging resistance. Eventually, the Dark Angels reached the heart of the starport city. This was where Arcos and his Alpha Legion had set a trap. While the Dark Angels were focusing on the traitor guard units and the obvious defenders, the Alpha Legion Marines had quietly repositioned. On the 8th day of fighting, as Azrael's forces were about to secure the main transit hub, the Alpha Legions sprung their ambush. Arcos the Faithless and a cadre of his Chaos Space Marines slammed into the Dark Angels' vanguard from an unexpected direction, using underground access tunnels to appear almost in their midst. What followed was a rare and epic confrontation. Azrael, the supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels, found himself in single combat with Arcos, the Chaos Lord. Accounts say that Arcos was a formidable duelist, enhanced by the dark powers, wielding a demon-tainted blade. Azrael is one of the deadliest warriors of the Imperium, but even he was initially outmatched by Arcos' ferocity. Arcos struck a grievous blow that could have felled Azrael, yet before the Chaos Lord could finish him, the tables turned. Azrael's honor guard, the Deathwing Terminators, 1st Company veterans in tactical dreadnought armor, arrived as reinforcement. Clad in thick ceramite and armed with crackling power fists and blades, these Terminators barreled into the fray and forced Arcos back. The Chaos ambushers, faced with an entire company of Dark Angels now retaliating, chose not to get bogged down. Arcos, ever the calculating survivor, withdrew, but not without inflicting pain. The Dark Angels had suffered over 200 battle brothers dead or wounded in the starport battle, a significant chunk of their strike force. They did, however, secure Vraks' starport after this fight, raising the Lion's banner, the Dark Angel's symbol, over its smoking ruins. With the starport captured, the Imperium finally had a reliable landing zone for heavy equipment and supplies, which was a boon. But the victory was bittersweet. The Dark Angels, having taken serious losses and, perhaps, achieved whatever secret goal they had, though Arcos escaped their clutches at that time, did not plan to stick around for the war of attrition. Space Marines seldom have the patience for siege attrition, and Azrael likely had other matters to attend to. The Dark Angels' intervention was a dramatic chapter, but ultimately a side quest in the Grand Siege. They handed over the secured starport to the Imperial Guard's keeping and left Vraks, presumably to nurse their wounds and carry on their eternal hunt for the fallen elsewhere. The starport battle had other consequences too. Arcos and his Alpha Legion warband, though beaten from the starport, remained at large on Vraks, and Arcos was incensed enough to call for help. Using sorcerous means, some psychic signal broadcast through the warp by his coven of sorcerers, Arcos effectively lit the chaos equivalent of a beacon, calling all allies who hated the Imperium and fancied a good fight to come to Vraks. Vraks, in effect, became a magnet for chaos warbands from across that sector of the galaxy. The war was about to get a lot more crowded. Arcos' call did not go unanswered. Across the stars, various bands of Chaos Space Marines, roving reavers, and renegades heard the psychic summons or caught wind through their dark networks. Vraks was where the action was, and the Blood God and others would be pleased by those who spilled blood there. Soon, a formidable Chaos fleet was mustering, drawn from disparate warbands united only by their hatred of the Imperium. By late 821 M41, Imperial Navy pickets detected a fleet of over 30 vessels, translating into the vicinity of the Scaris sector, heading towards Vraks. Rear Admiral Rasiak, commanding what meager Imperial naval forces were patrolling near Vraks, scrambled to respond. He had only a handful of warships at his disposal. The Segmentum Command hadn't assigned a huge fleet to Vraks, likely assuming the ground forces had it covered. Now they faced an armada of traitor ships, a despoiler-class battleship ominously named Anarchy's Heart, identified later as Arcos's flagship, along with cruisers, grand cruisers, and a horde of raider escorts and likely demonic supply vessels. The first engagement, the Battle of the Vraks system, was a desperate attempt by Rasiak to shield the planet. His flagship, the lunar-class cruiser, Lord Bellerophon, led a ragtag group of cruisers and frigates to intercept the Chaos flotilla. In an initial skirmish, the Imperial ships did manage to bloody the nose of the approaching traitors. A few escort ships on both sides were reduced to scrap in probing exchanges. But it was just a test. 6 days later, the full Chaos fleet bore down on Vraks. The ensuing space battle was brief but violent. Anarchy's Heart alone outgunned any 2 Imperial cruisers combined, and it was flanked by hellish consorts brimming with plasma broadsides and launch bays spewing Chaos attack craft. The Lord Bellerophon and her sister ships put up a valiant fight amid the void, cannons belching in the darkness, torpedoes leaving glowing trails. But the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, the Imperial defenders were outmaneuvered and outshot. With multiple decks aflame and her hull buckling, Lord Bellerophon had no choice but to execute a warp jump to escape destruction. Rasiak's surviving ships limped away, leaving Vrax's orbit firmly in enemy hands. Now the skies belonged to Chaos. This was very bad news for the Imperial Guard on the surface. Orbital superiority meant the traitors could land troops and supplies at will, or worse, rainfire from above. And rainfire they did. Not long after the fleet's victory, those on the ground saw new stars streaking through the sky, drop pods and assault craft plunging down like meteors. The true nightmare was about to begin for the besiegers. The first blow from above came from a World Eater's warband, calling themselves the Berserkers of Scalathrax. These were horn-worshipping, chain-axe-wielding lunatics. Exactly what you picture when you imagine Chaos Space Marines devoted to the Blood God. A sizable force of them launched in Dreadclaw drop pods from their strike cruiser, Blood Dawn. Their target, the relatively thin rear lines of the Imperial siege works. Remember, the Krieg regiments had been focusing forward, grinding towards the citadel. They weren't expecting a massive enemy force to literally drop out of the sky behind them. At Mortuary Ridge, a strategic high ground near the main fortress that the Krieg were in the process of assaulting, all hell broke loose. Without warning, the sky howled, and streaks of fire slammed into the ground amid the Imperial artillery positions and command posts. Dreadclaw pods bored into the earth, their doors explosively popping open to disgorge power-armored berserkers already roaring prayers to Khorne. They tore into the rear echelon troops and artillery crews like wolves among sheep. At nearly the same time, Anarchy's Heart above performed an orbital bombardment. Gigantic macro-cannon shells the size of drop pods themselves came screaming down, erupting in titanic explosions among the crowded Imperial lines. Barracks and ammo dumps vanished in gouts of flame, Entire platoons were simply there one moment and gone the next, replaced by smoking craters. The sudden chaos with a small c was unimaginable. The disciplined formations of the Death Corps were thrown into disarray for the first time in the war. You had thousands of crazed Khorne berserkers, gene-enhanced super soldiers in blood-red armor, rampaging through artillery parks, lopping off heads and turning heavy guns around to fire on Imperial positions. Meanwhile, more and more landing craft were coming down elsewhere. Thunderhawk gunships carrying traitor Astartes from other warbands, cargo landers vomiting out hordes of cultist reinforcements, even a few shuttles unloading twisted war engines and tanks. This was the nightmare scenario, the besiegers becoming the besieged, attacked from both front and rear. The proud regiments of Krieg, already worn down by years of attrition, found themselves surrounded and fighting in all directions. Communications broke down amidst the cacophony. Some Imperial units maintained coherent defense, forming squares or last stands around bunkers, but others were completely overrun. Among the Chaos reinforcements were not just the World Eaters. Arcos's plea had attracted a who's who of traitor legions, contingents of Death Guard, followers of Nurgle, the Plague God, Iron Warriors, siege specialists turned heretic, no doubt drawn to a grand siege like moths to flame. Black Legion, the largest Chaos Legion, veterans of the Long War, and assorted others. Each warband brought its specialty. The Death Guard, for instance, trudged through the chemical-saturated mud immune to poison, spreading disease and using alchemical weapons. The Iron Warriors expertly fortified positions they captured and turned Imperial trenches into their own strongpoints. The Black Legionnaires acted as heavy shock troops where needed. Accompanying them were tens of thousands of mortal chaos cultists and mutants. Picture deranged cult militia charging with autoguns and rusty blades behind their space marine overlords, or herds of mutant creatures, goat-headed beastmen, tentacled abominations, swarming into the fray hungry for flesh. Vraks, which was already a vision of hell, now hosted a literal circus of the damned. The Imperials also soon faced a dire new threat: traitor titans. Yes, the Dark Mechanicum had sent engines of war from Legio Vulcanum, a Titan legion long corrupted by chaos. On the horizon, towering silhouettes emerged, Warhound and Reaver-class Titans bearing spiked carapaces and oozing corruption from their joints. These god machines, easily 15 to 30 meters tall, stepped onto Vraks's soil and opened up with their weapons: volcano cannons, plasma blast guns, turbo lasers, adding to the absolute devastation of the Imperial lines. It's one thing to face entrenched guns or even super-heavy tanks. It's another to suddenly be staring up at a walking fortress that can level companies with a single salvo. Seizing the moment, the Vraksian defenders under Xaphan, or rather under the guidance of Chaos champions, since Xaphan's influence was waning in favor of these warlords, launched a general sortie from the citadel and inner defenses. They figured, rightly, that the Imperial siege lines were in chaos, and it was time to break the siege from the inside. So the forces that had been hunkered down defending now surged forward. The battered Krieg regiments suddenly found enemies coming from the front trenches they'd been assailing moments ago, even as Chaos Marines and cultists hit them from behind. The front became fluid, like a broken dam bursting. Not a neat line anymore, but a swirling melee across multiple sectors. To an observer, it might have looked like the entire 88th Siege Army was about to be annihilated on Vraks. What had been a slow, grinding, but relatively orderly, if horrific, siege, now became pandemonium. Here were these regiments that had been slogging forward one trench at a time, now suddenly either in headlong flight or making desperate stands in isolated pockets. Command and control for the Imperials was all but lost on the ground. When word of this disaster reached Segmentum Command, the response was swift and merciless. Heads would roll, figuratively and possibly literally, if Vraks was lost entirely. The decision came down to relieve Lord General Zwelka of command. Scapegoat or not, he had overseen a campaign that was now in dire straits. One imagines the terse astropathic message, "Lord Commander Zwelka is dismissed from duty. Effective immediately. Command of a Vraks operation transferred to Marshal Amim Kargori. Emperor protects." Marshal Amim Kargori was a seasoned commander with a far less illustrious family name than Zwelka, but presumably more practical sense. He was rushed in to salvage the situation, essentially becoming the new supreme commander on Vraks. His first order of business: don't let the 88th Siege Army get completely slaughtered. Kargori coordinated a fighting withdrawal of the fragmented Imperial forces to more defensible positions. He basically reorganized on the fly, consolidating whatever regiments he could into ad hoc battle groups to create defensive perimeters. For the soldiers of Krieg, retreat was a bitter pill, but an organized retreat now might prevent total destruction and allow them to fight another day. They fell back from some advanced positions they'd bled for, regrouping closer to their original landing zones and supply caches. Meanwhile, Kargori signaled the desperate need for reinforcements and heavy support. It was abundantly clear that without significant new forces and some Titan support of their own, Vraks was lost. The request did not fall on deaf ears. The Imperium may be ponderous, but when truly cornered, it can react with overwhelming might. Battle Fleet Scarus started scrambling any available warship to head toward Vraks and challenge the Chaos orbital supremacy. The Adeptus Mechanicus Collegia Titanica responded too, deploying elements of Legio Astorum, known as the Warp Runners, a loyalist Titan legion of great renown, to assist. And most importantly, fresh troops were drawn from Krieg and other nearby Imperial Guard muster worlds to reinforce the 88th Siege Army. In the interim, those on Vraks had to endure the storm. By now, Xaphan himself was somewhat sidelined. The war he started had been hijacked by the more powerful Chaos warlords present. Arcos, Jufor, and others didn't exactly take orders from a pudgy cardinal when there were worlds to burn and personal glory to be had. Xaphan became a figurehead, trotted out for propaganda perhaps, but no longer in direct control of his rebellion. He reportedly started making fewer public appearances, possibly fearing assassination or perhaps busy nursing his ego while the real war passed him by. Some say he retreated into prayer and madness in his palace as the Chaos champions effectively took over the defense, or now offense, of Vraks. One of those champions was a fetid sorcerer named Necrosius, formerly of the Death Guard's Apostles of Contagion warband, who saw Vraks as a perfect garden for Nurgle's gifts. Under his guidance, and with Deacon Mamon's blessing, the Nurgle-aligned forces on Vraks decided to unleash a special horror they had cooked up in Vrax's biochemical stockpiles. They deployed a chemical weapon referred to as TP3, its technical Militarum designation. This was a particularly nasty gas or toxin that could dissolve organics and eat through many filters. The Krieg soldiers, famously equipped with their signature gas masks and rebreathers at all times, discovered to their dread that even those masks could not fully protect them from TP3. During one engagement, the 19th Krieg Regiment's position was hit by shells releasing a billowing greenish gas. Within minutes, soldiers began clawing at their throats as the corrosive agent found its way past seals and through the very rubber and glass of their masks. Flesh blistered and melted. An entire regiment died choking on their own liquefied lungs. This harvest of Nurgle delighted the Plague Marines who watched and trudged in afterward through the slimy remains. For the Imperium, it was a wake-up call that the enemy was willing to use the most forbidden of weapons. Not that the Imperium wouldn't also use such weapons. They would, and eventually did, but to suffer it is another matter. Amid the chaos on the ground, a stroke of luck, or the Emperor's grace, depending on who you ask, came in space. The traitor fleet in orbit didn't stick around in full force for very long. Many Chaos warbands are, by nature, opportunistic and unreliable allies to each other. Once they had offloaded their warbands and supplies to Vraks' surface, a number of the Chaos captains had no interest in staying to provide orbital support or to fight whatever Imperial navy might be coming. Some sought easier plunder elsewhere. Others simply followed their own agendas. Within weeks of dominating orbit, the majority of the Chaos vessels moved on, leaving behind only Arcos' core ships, chiefly Anarchy's Heart, and a few escorts, to maintain a presence. Perhaps they assumed the ground battle was as good as won, and there was loot to be had elsewhere. This proved to be a mistake for Chaos and a reprieve for the Imperium. When Battlefleet Scarus's reinforcement detachment finally arrived in system, they found that only Arcos' battleship and some escorts were there to contest them. In what's known as the Second Battle of the Vraks system, the Imperial Navy, now with a battleship of its own, Duke of Byzantium or Duke Deval, accounts vary on the name, engaged Anarchy's Heart. The duel was titanic. The void shields of both gargantuan ships blazed under impacts. The end result? The Anarchy's Heart took a pounding it hadn't expected and, not keen on being destroyed, translated out of the system, trailing atmosphere and debris. Arcos' fleet presence thus withdrew, likely planning to return or repair, but for the time being gone. The space above Vraks was clear enough now for the Imperials to move in their reinforcement transports, and, crucially, the Titans of Legio Astorum. Back on Vraks, battered Imperial guardsmen who had been pushed to the brink suddenly saw fiery contrails in the sky, resolving into friendly dropships. From these, salvation lumbered forth. Bright blue and yellow-hued Titans marked with the Warp Runner's sigil. Mighty Reaver-class Titans and packs of Warhounds stepped off landers with earth-shaking thuds. With them came fresh Krieg regiments. Thousands of new soldiers disembarking in relatively secure landing zones near the regained starport, and even some units from other Imperial Guard lineages seconded to the campaign, though the Death Corps still made up the bulk. Marshal Kargori wasted no time. He launched what became known as the Kargori Offensive. This was a massive counter-push, aimed not just at reclaiming lost ground, but at breaking the momentum of the Chaos onslaught. Imperial Titans bellowed machine war cries and advanced to engage the traitor Titans of Legio Vulcanum. These battles of gods were awe-inspiring and terrifying, towering war engines exchanging energy blasts that turned sand to glass and sent shock waves flattening buildings. In one notable clash, a loyalist Reaver Titan dueled a corrupted Reaver of Legio Vulcanum at point-blank Chainblade versus Chainblade, until the traitor's reactor went critical and it collapsed in a heap of molten metal. The presence of the Emperor's Titans helped turn the tide. The traitor Titans began to fall back after losing nearly a dozen of their number in various engagements to superior loyalist coordination and perhaps a bit of vengeance-fueled fury. Meanwhile, on the infantry level, the new Imperial troops shored up defenses and began grinding forward again. This time, they fought side by side with their old comrades in an odd mix of relief and bitterness. Relief to not be entirely wiped out. Bitterness that all this hard-won ground was being soaked again in blood they'd already spilled once. Kargori's approach was not subtle. Use attrition on the enemy like they had planned to do originally, just now applying it to the Chaos interlopers and traitors who had come out of their holes. The war essentially reset to a siege again, albeit with the lines shifted and a more motley mix of enemies on the other side. Slowly, painfully, the Imperials pushed the Chaos forces out of the immediate areas they had overrun during the Chaos counteroffensive. Trenches were retaken, often filled with the remains of their previous owners. The ground lost in the north was gradually recaptured. The front lines stabilized roughly where they had been, or a bit forward, with both sides now more intermingled. One striking feature of this stage of war was how chaotic, pun intended, the battle zones had become. Unlike earlier, where you had a relatively clear dichotomy of Imperial side versus Rebel side of no man's land, now there were pockets of Chaos warriors that had punched deep and fought it up, needing to be rooted out like tumors. Some Chaos warbands operated behind what used to be Imperial lines, cut off but still deadly, like a pack of cornate berserkers who'd taken over an underground bunker and refused to surrender, forcing the Imperials to literally bury them in with demolition charges. As both armies licked their wounds and refortified, Marshal Kargori pondered how to avoid a repeat of that near disaster. He realized that conventional surface tactics alone wouldn't cut it against such an agile and varied foe. So he opened new theaters of war, one below ground and one in the skies. The war beneath Vraks began. The Death Corps famously employ combat engineers skilled in siegecraft. Kargori ordered these engineers to start digging tunnels and sapping toward enemy lines wherever possible. The plan: tunnel under Chaos-held trenches or strong points, and plant massive explosive charges, or even break through and attack from below. It was incredibly dangerous work, men digging in darkness, the constant fear of enemy counter-tunnels, or of running into something horrible beneath. Remember, Chaos sorcerers and Nurgle things lurked in the slimy depths too. Entire tunnel teams sometimes vanished, only discovered later as purpled corpses from some gas pocket, or perhaps torn apart by subterranean ambushes. Both sides ended up engaging in this underground warfare. Traitor engineers, and likely slave mutants, dug counter-tunnels to collapse Imperial ones. There were moments where listening posts heard the enemy scraping just yards away through a wall of dirt, ensuing in frantic silent efforts to either break through and attack or to detonate charges to cave in the tunnel before the foe did the same. This cat-and-mouse game below ground added a new layer of horror, as if the surface wasn't bad enough. Men fought in pitch-black tunnels, muzzle flashes lighting grim faces for split seconds amid choking dust, with ear-shattering detonations collapsing earthen ceilings, burying friend and foe alike. A war within a war. Above ground, Kargori also sought dominance in the air. The Imperial Navy and Aeronautica Imperialis scrambled more aircraft to Vraks. Squadrons of Thunderbolt fighters and Marauder bombers streaked into the toxic skies to duel with Chaos Hellblade and Hell Talon fighter craft. At first, the skies were as fiercely contested as the ground. Dogfights spun contrails among the clouds of ash and smoke. Many an ace pilot on both sides found their end spiraling down to the pockmarked fields of Vraks. But gradually, weight of Imperial numbers and better coordination began to tell. The Imperials managed to establish local air superiority in some sectors. This was crucial for the next planned offensives, as it would allow more effective close air support, strafing runs and bombings on Chaos positions to soften them up before the next big push. Despite these efforts, progress was still grindingly slow. Every minor victory seemed to cost an appalling price in lives. The Administratum back on distant worlds started getting cold feet about this whole enterprise. The accounts coming in from Vraks were not encouraging. Millions dead, timeline overshot, resources being drained that were needed on other fronts of the Imperium. At some high-level meetings, bean counters and strategos likely argued that Vraks might not be worth further investment. After all, the initial goal, preventing the arms from falling to heretics, had partially failed since so many were expended or chaos-touched by now, and the world itself was becoming a lost cause economically. As a result, some regiments that were slated for Vraks were instead diverted elsewhere by order of the Administratum. Replacements trickled slower. Suddenly, Marshal Kargori got messages that no further reinforcements would be coming beyond what was already on the way, and in fact, a dozen regiments currently present would be withdrawn for other war zones gradually. In essence, Vraks was being downgraded in priority. They were expected to finish the job with what they had, and what they had was gradually shrinking. It was an insult to the sacrifice already made, but also a cold calculation. The war had to end one way or another, but the Imperium's overall war machine couldn't afford to sink everything into Vraks indefinitely. Kargori, frustrated but undaunted, decided that if he couldn't get more guardsmen, he'd try something else. Something that had already proven its worth on a smaller scale. He turned again to the idea of Space Marine assistance. The Dark Angels had come and gone, but there were other chapters out there. Through whatever channels, likely via inquisitorial contacts or high command influence, he managed to open negotiations with the Red Scorpions, a respected but somewhat reclusive Space Marine chapter, known for their zealous adherence to purity and loyalty to the Imperium's chain of command. They often worked with the Inquisition directly in other campaigns. It took some convincing, one doesn't simply order Astartes around, but eventually the Red Scorpions agreed to commit a contingent to Vraks. Perhaps they were enticed by the promise of battling Chaos Space Marines. The Red Scorpions despised mutation and heresy, so fighting traitor Marines would appeal to their ethos of purity. Or perhaps the Inquisition pulled strings. We do know the Ordo Malleus was taking more interest. Either way, reinforcement was coming, not in the thousands, but in the quality of a few hundred Astartes. Sometimes that's enough to tip the scales in a critical moment. And indeed, the Red Scorpions were about to deliver such a critical moment. The Red Scorpions' strike force arrived in orbit around Vraks in 824 M41 after careful planning. They didn't come as a full chapter, only a company strength force, but that was still around 100+ veteran Space Marines, many in Terminator armor. Chapter Master Karab Cullen himself, a legendary warrior, was in command. Negotiations had stipulated a specific mission. The Red Scorpions would perform a targeted assault to break a deadlock, and once achieved, they would not tarry long in the trenches. Space Marines excel at shock assaults, not garrison duty. Marshal Kargori pinpointed the location for them, Sector 5744, a section of the front where previous Imperial mining and assaults had created a partial breach in the enemy lines. This sector had changed hands multiple times, but currently it was contested and partly in chaos control, partly a no-man's land of ruined defenses. If the Red Scorpions could punch through here decisively, it would give the Imperium a direct path into the lower approaches of the Citadel itself, something they'd been striving for all these years. Operation Executioner's Place, the ominous codename chosen for this assault, was set into motion. At dawn, without warning to the enemy, Red Scorpions drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships descended at Sector 5744. The effect was akin to a surgical scalpel stabbing into a festering wound. Veteran Astartes, clad in slate-gray power armor and Terminator suits, materialized in the midst of stunned renegade lines. Bolters flared, power swords sliced. It was a one-sided slaughter at the point of impact. The traitor militia holding the ruined trenches in that sector were utterly unprepared for superhuman warriors suddenly appearing behind their heavy stubbers. The Chaos forces, of course, reacted as quickly as they could. Within minutes, a countercharge was mounted by some of their shock troops. A pack of chaos ogrines, horribly augmented abhumans, huge and muscle-bound, now devoted to chaos, came thundering toward the Red Scorpions with improvised melee weapons and sheer brute force. These monstrosities would have terrified normal soldiers, but the Red Scorpion assault terminators met them head-on. In a clash reminiscent of mythic heroics, 8-foot-tall terminators swung crackling thunder hammers and brought down the enraged Ogrines one by one, though not without a few Marines being swatted aside or injured. Terminators can take a lot of punishment. Meanwhile, as the breach was secured, Kargori's plan kicked in. Imperial Guard units that had been standing by, Krieg infantry and armored elements who were prepped for this moment, rushed forward to exploit the gap. Gorgon-armored transports, basically giant armored troop carriers like mobile fortresses, rumbled through the broken defenses, carrying wave after wave of reinforcements into the heart of the enemy line, now that the Astartes had cracked it open. Of course, Chaos wouldn't let such a gain go uncontested. Once they got over the initial shock, they attempted a major counterattack at the breach. This time, they threw something truly terrifying at it. Chaos Titans of Legio Vulcanum again, and their infantry support, hoping to stomp out the Astartes-led incursion. One towering Reaver Titan, emblazoned with runes of Khorne, waded towards Sector 5744 to literally crush the breach under its feet. The Imperials were ready, having anticipated this reaction. Loyalist Titans from Legio Astorum, held in reserve, moved to intercept once more. In an echo of earlier clashes, massive war engines exchanged fire at point blank near the breach. The Warp Runners' princeps knew they had to protect the breach at all costs. They did, managing to force Legio Vulcanum's god engines to pull back. One traitor Warhound Titan was blown apart in the fray, its cockpit punctured by a direct hit from a Warp Runner's Reaver's melta cannon, causing it to detonate spectacularly. The remaining Chaos Titans withdrew rather than be destroyed, leaving the battlefield momentarily free of their looming shadows. With the enemy counterattack thwarted, the objective of Operation Executioner's Place was achieved. The breach in Sector 5744 was firmly in Imperial hands, widened and shored up with fortifications by sweating engineers. The Red Scorpions, mission accomplished, prepared to extract. True to agreement, they didn't plan to stay and garrison trenches indefinitely. They pulled out as swiftly as they'd come, disappearing into the sky via Thunderhawks, likely bound for orbit and other duties. They had lost a few battle brothers in the fierce fighting, but the impact of their assault far outweighed their casualties. Now the Imperium had something it hadn't possessed since the war's beginning: a relatively clean path toward the main citadel. They were at the inner gate, so to speak. Only the final ring of defenses, the ones directly around the citadel of Vraks, remained between them and their ultimate goal. But in war, good news often comes with bad news lurking behind it. Reports started to emerge among the troops of strange occurrences. Some soldiers complained of nightmares, more so than usual in that hellscape. Auspex readings showed bizarre energy surges. A sense of dread beyond the normal depressive pall of trench warfare began to creep into men's minds. Such signs did not go unnoticed by those trained to recognize them. The Ordo Malleus, the Inquisition branch dealing with demons and the supernatural, was already keeping an eye on Vraks after the Chaos Marine incursion. Their agents recognized the symptoms. These were portents of a warp breach, indications that someone on the enemy side was likely preparing a major demonic event. You see, all the carnage and prolonged bloodshed on Vraks had created ripe conditions for a demon summoning. The veil between the warp and real space thins in places saturated by suffering and sorcery. And we know already that Jufor had allied with the sanctified warband with the explicit plan to open a warp portal to Khorne's domain. Those ill omens were basically the early warning signs of that plan nearing fruition. The Ordo Malleus decided it was time to intervene directly. They had allowed the Ordo Hereticus, who originally was concerned with the heretic Cardinal, to run the show up till now, but a full-on demonic incursion changed jurisdiction, as it were. At a gathering on Thracian Primaris or some other safe spot, a conclave of inquisitors determined that they needed to take command. Chief among them was Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, a famously formidable demon hunter. It didn't take long for Lord Rex to assert operational control. The High Lords of Terra themselves, upon being briefed, sanctioned that the Inquisition, Ordo Malleus, would direct the final stages of Vraks. Frankly, at this point, any help was likely welcomed by Kargori, who just wanted to get the job done and might not mind an Inquisitor taking some burden, although having Inquisitors in charge can be a double-edged sword for Guard commanders. Hector Rex arrived with substantial backup. He didn't come alone with a fancy hat and a finger to wag. He brought Grey Knights. The Grey Knights are the elite, secretive chapter of Space Marines who specialize in fighting demons, literally the best of the best for that role, each a psyker warrior with sacred arms. Alongside them, a chapter called the Red Hunters, also deployed to Vraks at the Ordo's request. The Red Hunters are known to work closely with the Inquisition. They even ritually mind-wipe themselves after certain missions to keep inquisitorial secrets. That's how loyal they are. These Space Marines, along with squads of inquisitorial stormtroopers, elite human troops under the Inquisition, formed the sharp end of the Ordo Malleus intervention. The 88th Siege Army's command structure was reshuffled. Hector Rex effectively assumed supreme command authority planetside, while Marshal Kargori and the Guard High Staff deferred to him on strategic direction. The goal was singular: prevent or counter the impending demon incursion and finish this war. Thus, by 825 to 826 M41, the scene was set for the endgame. The Imperium had re-secured momentum. They had a breach leading to the Citadel. They had the demon-fighting specialists on hand, knowing something wicked was coming, and they had a fresh perspective. Sometimes a shake-up in command can invigorate an effort, or at least change priorities. Under Rex's leadership, purging Vraks of chaos taint became as important as simply retaking the planet. The war had morphed beyond just crushing a renegade cardinal. It was now a full-scale exterminatus avoidance and demon containment operation. Imperial forces reorganized for the final push. Plans were drawn for a multi-pronged assault to storm the Citadel itself, while simultaneously bracing for whatever unholy trick the enemy had in store. Everyone could sense the climax approaching. Some guardsmen wrote letters that would never be delivered, as if anticipating their end. Others checked their weapons with steely resolve. The air crackled, literally sometimes with warp energies, and figuratively with tension. 18 years of struggle were about to culminate in one apocalyptic showdown on that blasted armory world. Hector Rex certainly wasn't twiddling his thumbs. He was out there on the front lines in ornate Terminator armor, inscribed with wards of banishment, rallying the troops, directing his retinue. The Grey Knights prepared sacred rites of battle, etching purity seals and blessings onto their ammo. They knew what was coming, even if the rank-and-file guardsmen only had vague horror stories to go by. The time had come to storm Vrax's heart and confront whatever horrors awaited there. The final campaign for the Citadel unfolded in several brutal acts. The Imperials, under Inquisitor Rex's direction, began pressing on all fronts to squeeze the defenders back into the citadel. They aimed to encircle the fortress, cutting off any escape or maneuver. The traitors, for their part, were increasingly fighting among themselves as much as against the Imperium, but more on that in a moment. First came the push through what the guardsmen grimly nicknamed the Green Hell. This was a swath of terrain just outside the citadel's lower works that had been thoroughly befouled by Nurgle's influence. The Nurgle warbands, the Purge, Apostles of Contagion, and Lords of Decay, among others, had turned this zone into a toxic nightmare. It was littered with the rotten carcasses of previous battles, awash in hazardous chemicals, and crawling with swarms of Nurglings and plague-ridden vermin. Foul demon engines belching corrosive gas prowled here. Think of grotesque mechanical beast hybrids blessed by Nurgle, like sludge-spewing tanks and insectile demon walkers. The Death Corps' 30th Line Corps drew the short straw to assault this putrid killing field. Clad in their usual greatcoats and gas masks, they advanced, finding that their filters barely kept out the stinging, mildewed reek of the air. Over 8 days, these guardsmen engaged in some of the most horrific fighting of the war, and that's saying something. They faced plague marines of the Death Guard Legion, swollen, pustulant giants who soaked up last fire and kept moving, bolters coughing out diseased rounds. These traitors could fight on after injuries that would drop a normal man, or even a normal space marine. The Krieg soldiers found that only heavy weapons or very close-range volleys would put them down, and even then, often the plague marine would burst into nauseating clouds of spores or bile as a parting gift. The Imperials tried to even the odds by bringing in their own chemical weapons. In a grim bit of symmetry, they fired phosphex canisters and toxin shells, weapons so terrible that normally only in extremis would they be sanctioned, into pockets of heavy Nurgle resistance. Green gouts of alchemical fire clung to anything it touched, incinerating even the corrupted flesh. Phosphex is a horror, burning so hot and so persistently that not even the muddy ground could quench it. But against the Death Guard, such measures had limited effect. Those plague-ridden Astartes marched through clouds of poison with impunity, and some even laughed, or the wet, phlegmy equivalent of laughter, at attempts to kill them with disease or toxin. They were, after all, already bloated with plagues and corruption beyond what any man-made weapon could inflict. Nevertheless, sheer attrition and courage, or fatalism, pushed the 30th Corps forward, inch by inch. They took appalling casualties. Entire companies would charge a demon engine's nest only to be dissolved by jets of toxic slime from a bile cannon. But then the next wave of Krieg stepped stoically over the liquefied remains of their comrades and kept firing. Eventually, the Green Hell area was secured, insofar as one could secure a blighted land where the very ground was poisonous. They had carved a path of corpse-choked trenches through it, but at tremendous cost, and the survivors had a haunted look behind their mask lenses after what they'd witnessed. Importantly, the line was now close enough to the citadel that they could directly observe its looming walls through the haze. While the Imperials pressed in, inside the citadel and its surrounding tunnels, a power struggle was reaching its climax. Lord Jufor, champion of Khorne, leader of the Skull-Takers, and now effectively the warlord of Vraks, had been busy executing his own plan. He was determined that this war should not end too soon. He wanted it to continue indefinitely, an ever-flowing fountain of blood for Khorne. The signs of faltering among the defenders enraged him. Some human traitors had started to lose heart as the noose tightened. Talk of falling back or deserting, perhaps. Jufor responded the only way a Khornate warlord knows, by slaughtering anyone he considered cowardly. Reports from the front that some units had fled rather than fight, and that the enemy was almost at the curtain wall brought swift and bloody retribution. Xaphan could not suffer such weak-willed cowardice, and Khorne must see it avenged. Driven by his own ambition and a desire to prolong the war, Lord Xaphan, commanding the largest Khornate warband, moved to stop the rot before it brought the whole house down. He had only come to Vraks to bring slaughter in Khorne's name, and he neither served nor recognized the authority of Cardinal Xaphan. Xaphan's warband, like the others, had no loyalty to anybody but their lords and their god. Such men made dangerous allies, potent on the battlefield, but with the situation at the front deteriorating and with supplies becoming scarce, the Chaos warbands quickly turned against their allies and against each other. Death was Xaphan's only motivation, to continue the killing until the last drop of blood had been squeezed from Vraks. For him, this war was far from over. Xaphan planned to take over Vraks. Xaphan had bided his time, but now he chose to strike. Mastery of the Khorne-worshipping warbands was the first of his two tasks. They respected only martial prowess, and few could match Xaphan's. A giant of a man in Terminator armor, he led by example and by fear. Now he challenged the leader of the Berserkers of Skalithax to single combat. The duel was to the death, Xaphan winning the mighty combat. Striking the head from his opponent, he raised it to the baying crowd and claimed, by right of conquest, lordship over the Berserkers of Skalithax. Any who would oppose his rule must fight him now. None did. Xaphan was Khorne's chosen champion on Vraks, and now he ruled the World Eaters contingent. Next, Xaphan subjugated the Sanctified. To do so, he made them an offer: sign a pact and swear to follow him for the duration of the war, and in return he would provide the Sanctified with all they needed to open a warp portal on Vraks. The Sanctified were demonancers, and they worked constantly to bring Khorne's children into the material universe. They had the expertise. Now Xaphan would provide them with the tens of thousands of sacrificial victims needed in order to create a warp portal through which demon legions could pour out. Xaphan also gave them a name and a bold promise. The promise was that he would facilitate the summoning of the Guardian of the Throne of Skulls himself, a hint at a mighty bloodthirster of Khorne, to come forth and bring fresh slaughter. The pact was too alluring to refuse. The Sanctified joined forces with Xaphan in order to summon the Lord of Bloodthirsters. The Khorne warbands were now united under Xaphan. Not all Chaos forces bent the knee. Arcos and the Alpha Legion did not submit to Xaphan, but in order to save his warband from being attacked, Arcos made his own treacherous deal. Of all the warband leaders, he alone had the trust of Cardinal Xaphan, who was hidden away inside his fortress. Arcos knew that the apostate cardinal was already little more than a figurehead, but to maintain his own independence he would allow Xaphan to capture the cardinal. The treacherous pact made, Arcos was true to his word. In secret, the Alpha Legion allowed Xaphan and his personal bodyguard of Terminator-armored killers into Xaphan's palace. The Alpha Legion sentries were quickly slaughtered by Xaphan and his men, who swept through the palace, leaving a trail of butchery behind them. Deacon Mammon and his closest guards fled to save themselves and would later be found fighting alongside the Nurgle warband of the Tainted. Although Mammon's own refuge was to be short-lived, the apostate Cardinal Xaphan's remaining loyal followers were massacred. His faithful servants' skulls would now join those piled before the Blood God's throne. Xaphan threw the Cardinal and his surviving cronies into Vrax's deepest dungeons to await his fate. Xaphan's coup was complete. By blood and treachery, he had made himself master of Vraks. The war was now his to fight. Millions would now march to his command and, as promised, there was a warp portal to construct. By now, Xaphan had lost most control over his forces. Arcos and the warlords of the various Chaos Space Marine warbands operating on the planet assumed direct control, and Xaphan became a mere figurehead who made less and less public appearances. Meanwhile, Lord Rex launched an assault on Hangman's Hill, hoping to disable the defense laser batteries around the Vraks citadel, which were slowly taken in bloody pitched battles. The primary summit was taken after 3 failed attacks, but beyond, the citadel of Vraks was now directly visible. But despite this victory, meddling by rivals of Rex within the Inquisition meant that the overall size of the 88th Siege Army was reduced when the High Lords of Terra themselves issued a direct decree to withdraw a dozen regiments. This grim turn of events, however, did not stop Rex from continuing the advance, attacking a key path to the citadel in the battle for Gate 579-459. The resulting battle was bloody, seeing the death of Commissar General Maw and the near collapse of the offensive due to an intervention by Hornate Berserkers and Chaos Terminators. However, the Guardsmen's sheer numbers and an armored thrust managed to beat back this counteroffensive. With Gate 579-459 in hand, the 88th Siege Army prepared for the final push on the Vraks citadel itself. The citadel was a daunting target, the most formidable defensive bastion on the planet. Guardsmen would have to face the murder slopes dug around the fortress and potentially foul demons that would be summoned by Chaos Space Marines. However, Rex knew that this bloody assault was necessary and planned 3 primary attacks from different directions. The attack began with a Gorgon advance, unloading Krieg guardsmen onto the murder slopes. Backed by tanks, artillery, and air power, all available resources at the 88th Siege Army's disposal were used. But as expected, all 3 attacks met with fierce resistance, and enormous losses were sustained by the Krieg troops. However, continuous artillery and aerial bombardment managed to finally overwhelm the Citadel's void shields, allowing for the Citadel itself to receive direct damage. As the Guardsmen finally reached the murder slopes, resistance was initially light. But this was just a ploy by enemy troops dug deep in the Citadel's walls, who opened up an enormous torrent of fire when the Krieg forces were close. A 7-day battle for a central ravine around the Citadel erupted, which not even an intervention by Titans could win for the Imperium. Finally, Rex realized that only the Adeptus Astartes could take the ravine, and the Red Hunters waiting in high orbit deployed from their drop pods. However, the enemy had expected such a maneuver, and the Red Hunter strike force of 150 battle brothers fell right into a trap. They were surrounded and annihilated to the man, with Krieg forces unable to aid them due to poor visibility. Several more attacks by the Krieg forces were made anyway, resulting in 2 entire regiments being butchered. Finally, the offensive on the ravine was called off a day later. Rex waited to organize a force of 68 Marauder bombers before launching a new assault on the ravine. This time, heavy air power combined with classical Krieg tactics of attrition and a major Titan offensive saw the ravine finally fall to Imperial hands. In coordination along the entire front, Krieg guardsmen were pushing forward, and in places they almost reached the walls. It was now that the guardsmen faced a heavy counterattack from the Black Brethren of Arias, which saw the Krieg troops pushed from the wall. More men were poured into the attacks along the walls, and 6 times over the course of a day did these positions change hands. The Sanctified were meanwhile unleashing demon engines through sacrificing prisoner souls to their infernal gods. On the 2nd day, the Krieg infantry launched a new offensive that was led by the Grey Knights and Lord Rex himself in order to combat the new daemonic forces at the disposal of the renegades. Overwhelming the traitor forces, the Imperial troops succeeded in taking the lower gate spur and defeated additional enemy counterattacks. It was the first victory of the last battle for Vraks. Just as the Imperials were tightening their grip, the demon lovers among the traitors sprung their trap. Near the lower gate foothold was an entrance known as St. Leonis Gate, one of the primary entrances to the Vraks citadel, named after the Basilica of St. Leonis that was part of the complex. The Red Scorpions, who had withdrawn earlier, returned at Rex's request to exploit the collapse of the traitor outer defenses. Striking quickly, they led an armored thrust, with Land Raider tanks at the fore, into the shattered remains of St. Leonis Gate, blasting apart its doors and purging the cultists guarding it. Their goal was to punch open yet another route into the fortress, hastening the fall. They succeeded in carving through the defenders and linking up with other Imperial forces deeper inside the courtyard. However, the timing was fateful, because at that very moment the ritual of the Sanctified reached completion in the cathedral spire above. With a thunderous, otherworldly roar, reality tore open inside the citadel's very heart. The air turned blood red. A portal to the warp yawned wide like a fiery maw. Demons of Horn, the blood god, came pouring through in a ravening tide. Bloodletters, the foot soldiers of Horn with their hellblades and snarling visages, materialized by the hundreds, immediately seeking skulls to harvest. Packs of flesh hounds, crimson demonic beasts, bounded out, frothing and howling with brass collars clanging. And behind them thundered a few mighty juggernauts, massive horned demon beasts of living brass ridden by exalted heralds of Khorne, their charge akin to demon-driven tanks. This sudden appearance of a demon legion in their midst would have broken many human armies. Even the Death Corps veterans balked momentarily. It's not every day that literal hellspawns pop into existence a few yards away. But the Space Marines, particularly the Red Scorpions and Grey Knights, reacted swiftly as they were trained to. The Red Scorpions at St. Leonis Gate did not flinch. Under Chapter Master Cullen's bellowed orders, they formed a defensive line, utilizing wrecked vehicles and fallen masonry as cover, and opened disciplined fire into the onrushing demons. Bolter shells, blessed and sanctified by their chaplain's prior, blew apart bloodletters in gory sprays. A dreadnought in the Red Scorpions contingent incinerated a pack of flesh hounds with its heavy flamer as they leapt, turning them to sooty vapor. The Red Scorpions had a motto of utmost purity and discipline, and here it paid off. They held firm, bolstered by righteous contempt for these warp-spawned abominations. Meanwhile, on another front within the citadel, Hector Rex and his Grey Knights spearheaded the push towards what was called the Cardinal's Gate, essentially the main entrance to the inner sanctum and palace of the citadel. They too encountered heavy demonic resistance, for the warp rift was not localized. Lesser breaches vomited forth demons all around the fortress interior. But if any men in the galaxy were equipped to handle this, it was the Grey Knights. These warriors had literally been created to destroy demons. Clad in gleaming silvered Aegis armor inscribed with wards of banishment, they moved in squads reciting the litany of abjuration. Bolts of psychic lightning and sanctified promethium flowed from their weapons, unmaking lesser demons by the score. It was going as crazy as it sounds, according to plan. The Grey Knights contained the demons, the Red Scorpions held their section, and the regular guard, inspired by these heroes and under the psychic protection of the Inquisitors, pressed on, until something emerged that was beyond anyone's expectations. From the largest warp rift in the cathedral hall, a shadow towered. With a bellow that shook the crumbling stained glass windows, a greater demon of Khorne stepped into reality. This was the dreaded Bloodthirster, a greater demon, one of Khorne's mightiest generals made manifest, And not just any bloodthirster, but Angrath the Unbound, an exalted lord of bloodthirsters, known in the forbidden tomes of demon hunters for being particularly massive and wrathful. His appearance was heralded by a wave of sheer terror. Many nearby guardsmen screamed or collapsed, their minds unable to cope. Angrath was a gargantuan, bull-headed fiend with a whip of spines and an axe the size of a tank. Upon entering the fray, he immediately demonstrated the gap between even a powerful demon and a greater demon. A Red Scorpion's land raider that had been laying fire nearby was backhanded by Angrath, literally swatted like a toy, and split in two, exploding as its fuel ignited. The bloodthirster roared a challenge to all comers, thirsting for the finest skulls present. The nearest Grey Knight squad engaged without hesitation. Their brother captain, a noble hero named Arturus, led them in an attack, calling upon the Emperor's name. It was like ants attacking a bull. Angrath swung his axe once. Brother Captain Arturus was cleaved nearly in twain, his blessed Terminator armor offering little protection against an axe meant to fell gods. The remaining Grey Knights fired and struck blows, but Angrath's hide was like iron, their efforts only enraging him further. At this critical juncture, Hector Rex himself stepped forward to confront the bloodthirster. Now, normally, an Inquisitor, even a Lord Inquisitor in artificer armor, would not last a heartbeat against a creature like this in single combat. But Rex was no ordinary man. He was a psyker of considerable might and had a potent force sword in hand, its blade inscribed with ancient runes of banishment. The duel between Hector Rex and Angrath was the stuff of legend that few mortals ever witness and live to tell. The bloodthirster lunged, and Rex somehow evaded, using his psychic powers to enhance his speed and strength. With precise timing, he struck at the demon. Accounts say he plunged his force sword straight into Angrath's chest, focusing his will and hatred of the creature into the blade. The weapon, empowered by Rex's faith and psychic might, managed to pierce the bloodthirster's defenses. In an earth-shaking howl of rage and pain, Angrath was banished, essentially exploding into a cloud of ash and fire, sent howling back into the warp from whence it came. The backlash of that banishment knocked Hector Rex flat and sent nearby rubble skittering. But the impossible had been done. One lone human, albeit a very powerful one, had banished a greater demon in direct combat. If any of the guardsmen saw this and comprehended it, their awe would be immeasurable. That moment really marked the turning of the tide definitively. The worst weapon in the enemy's arsenal, a greater demon, was off the field. The remaining hordes of lesser demons, though still dangerous, no longer had their general to coordinate their fury. The Imperials rallied with renewed fervor, pushing the demonic tide back gate by gate, hall by hall. It was at this juncture, with the battle clearly swinging to the Imperium, that a new set of warriors arrived unexpectedly on the scene. Dropships bearing the livery of the Angels of Absolution screamed down from the atmosphere. The Angels of Absolution, a successor chapter of the Dark Angels, had apparently been waiting in the wings, perhaps in hiding nearby or on standby, specifically for this moment. Under secret orders from Supreme Grand Master Azrael, back home recovering from the earlier campaign, presumably, they had held off, watching the siege from afar as it drew to a close. Why? Because they had their own agenda. Arcos the Faithless. The Angels of Absolution deployed rapidly in the thick of the fighting, but they didn't necessarily rush to aid the other Imperials in a general sense. They had a targeted objective. Guided by their own intel or mystical means, they beelined for the sector of the Citadel where Arcos and his Alpha Legion forces were holding out. The Alpha Legion, ever cunning, had made their own fallback redoubt in part of the Citadel's inner sanctum, possibly near a secret escape route or just a defensible spot. The Angels of Absolution struck them with precision. A particular duel took place amidst this. Master Belath, some sources say his name was Yafa, presumably the Angels of Absolution, equivalent of a chapter master, confronted Arcos the Faithless. Arcos was a superlative swordsman and fighter, and despite Belath being a chapter master equivalent, Arcos managed to mortally wound him during the fray. But the Dark Angel's successors fight as a group with a singular purpose. They overwhelmed Arcos's bodyguard and finally cornered him. Instead of killing him, which might be expected, they did something telling. They incapacitated and captured Arcos alive. This was a huge hint that Arcos was of special interest to the Unforgiven. Whether Arcos was actually one of the Fallen, one of the secret traitors of the Dark Angels from the Horus Heresy era, or simply knew something about them, the Dark Angels wanted him for themselves. The Angels of Absolution quickly hauled Arcos away, literally dragging the Chaos Lord in specialized restraints onto their transport. As quickly as they had appeared, they exfiltrated with their prize. Other Imperial forces, busy with their own fights, had little time to stop and question this. But one imagines Hector Rex might have been irked to see a high-value Chaos leader taken off-world without consultation. The Angels didn't care. They aren't in the habit of explaining themselves to other Imperial forces. They had what they came for. In orbit, their ships even hunted down Arcos's battle barge, Anarchy's Heart, which had been forced to flee but apparently lingered near Vraks. They destroyed it to ensure Arcos had no rescue or escape. Arcos's warband, leaderless and now under heavy assault from vengeful angels, disintegrated shortly thereafter. Back in the Citadel, the endgame was playing out. With demonic reinforcements dwindling, Grey Knights and Guard units systematically cleared each level of the fortress. Lord Hector Rex, not one to sit idle, personally led sweeps through the highest levels with his retinue and Grey Knights at his side. They found scenes of utter horror. Whole chapels defiled into sacrificial pits, piles of corpses, evidence of the monstrous ritual that had taken place. They also encountered the remnants of Cardinal Xaphan's personal entourage, or what was left of them. Remember Xaphan had been thrown in a dungeon by Jufor? Well, when they found him, he was no longer the rotund, fiery demagogue who started all this. The good Cardinal had by now undergone the final damnation that Chaos tends to reserve for its most devoted and often most deluded servants. Xaphan had been mutated by the powers of Chaos into a mindless, gibbering Chaos spawn. He was a quivering heap of flesh, tentacles, and half-formed limbs, utterly insane and in constant pain. Essentially the opposite of the glorious martyr he probably envisioned himself becoming. The once proud Cardinal was put out of his misery, mercy killed by a burst of storm bolter fire or a cleansing flame, depending on which account you believe. It was a pathetic end for the man who sparked an 18-year war, reduced to a spawn who likely didn't even know why it was being killed. In the depths of the Citadel, another discovery awaited: prisoners. Astonishingly, a handful of Adepta Sororitas, Sisters of Battle, were found alive in the dungeons. These were from that initial garrison at Vraks's Basilica, captured at the war's outset and kept as playthings for the depraved. 18 standard years of torture had left them speechless, traumatized beyond comprehension. Nonetheless, they were freed and given what comfort could be provided. The sight of them further cemented the righteous fury the Imperial troops felt, a renewed justification for every act of retribution they now carried out on any traitor still breathing. But by now, few traitors remained to punish. Most of the human traitor soldiers had either died fighting or surrendered once they saw the walls breached and demons vanishing. Those who surrendered were corralled for interrogation and likely execution later by the Inquisition. Of the big Chaos players, Arcos, captured. Cardinal Xaphan, mutated and dead. What of Xaphan and the Khornate warbands? Xaphan, never one to stick around when he couldn't spill blood, apparently decided that if he couldn't win this war, he'd at least deny the Imperium the satisfaction of killing him. With the warp rifts open courtesy of the Sanctified's ritual, Xaphan ordered a retreat. Not a panicked one, but a fighting withdrawal into the portals of the warp. He and the remains of his Skull-Takers, along with the surviving Sanctified sorcerers, essentially said, "Our work is done. Time to leave." Before departing as one final act of spite, or dark piety to Khorne, the Sanctified completed a secondary summoning. They conjured forth a demon prince known as Asbaramael, a monstrous servant of Khorne, who strode into the ruined citadel with his own retinue of bound lesser demons. Uraka's mission was simple: act as rearguard and cause as much carnage as possible to cover Xaphan's escape through the portals. Xaphan himself, it's worth noting, would survive Vraks and go on to further campaigns elsewhere, an enemy for another day, as it were. So, Asbaramael rampaged through the upper levels of the citadel, scattering any guard units he came across. But here, at last, the Imperium had precisely the tool needed, ready and waiting. Brother Captain Arvon Stern of the Grey Knights, a legendary demon slayer in his own right, led a fresh detachment of his brethren that had just teleported in from orbit. This was a second wave of Grey Knights that had been held in reserve on their strike cruiser in case of such a development. Stern's squad confronted Uraka in what must have been an earth-shattering battle amidst the flaming corridors. The Demon Prince, swollen with Khorne's might, roared and lunged, killing perhaps a couple of Grey Knights with his initial charge. But these were no normal Astartes. Every Grey Knight is a psyker whose will is bolstered by arcane wards and the Emperor's own genetic blessings. They met Uraka with sanctified blades and incantations that made the air around them hum. Stern himself engaged Uraka directly, an echo of Hector Rex's duel with Angrath earlier. Uraka swung a flaming axe. Stern parried with his nemesis force halberd, each clash releasing bursts of warp energy and psychic lightning. The fight was furious but not lengthy. Once the supporting Grey Knights banished Uraka's retinue and could lend their psychic might in unison, Uraka found himself weakening. In a final moment of triumph, Captain Stern drove the tip of his halberd into Uraka's chest while intoning the rite of banishment. Bound by the combined willpower of the Grey Knights present, the Demon Prince Uraka was torn from reality and thrust back into the warp with a howl of rage that dwindled into an echo. With his banishment, the last major demonic entity on Vraks was gone. Immediately, the Grey Knights turned their attention to sealing the rifts. Working together, the Brotherhood created a powerful psychic ward, a kind of ritual combined with their tech. With chants resonating through the blood-streaked halls, they closed the primary warp portal that the Sanctified had opened. The air cleared, and the oppressive, unnatural glow dimmed. The veil between worlds became solid once more, at least as much as it ever does on a place ravaged by so much chaos. And with that, the battle for Vraks, and indeed the entire siege, effectively ended. The shooting died down, save for isolated mop-up actions. After 18 years of near-constant warfare, silence fell over the charnel house of Vraks on 414/830 M41, Imperial dating. It was officially logged that Vraks Prime was secured by Imperial forces. In reality, secured meant that organized resistance was no more, though in those final moments Lord Hector Rex had a grim realization. Yes, they had won. The apostate cardinal was dealt with, the heretical rebellion crushed, the chaos forces expunged or fled. But what exactly had they reclaimed? The cost of the Siege of Vraks was almost beyond comprehension. When tallying the butcher's bill, the Departamento Militarum scribes estimated around 14 million Imperial Guard soldiers lost their lives on Vraks. 14 million sons and daughters of the Imperium ground into mud and dust on that armory world. Among them were hundreds of elite warriors. Numerous space marines from half a dozen chapters lay dead. The Dark Angels 200 at the starport, the entire Red Hunters Company, dozens of Red Scorpions, Grey Knights, and others. At least 4 Inquisitors gave their lives across the campaign's span. Even the mighty Titan legions suffered. 9 Loyalist Titans were destroyed, or so heavily damaged they had to be abandoned, and several Princeps and Titan crew ended up among the fallen. And the enemy? Vrax's original population was about 8 million, mostly workers. By the end of the siege, essentially none of those remained alive or sane. The traitor militia and renegade guard forces were annihilated to the last man in combat or execution. The myriad Chaos Space Marines mostly escaped or were killed to a man. Chaos warbands aren't known for surrendering. If one includes the literal legions of demons banished back to the warp, the number of casualties on the enemy side is incalculable. In any event, Vraks had become a charnel house. On that date in 830 M41, Lord Inquisitor Rex sent the signal, Vraks Prime is back in Imperial hands. A cheer might have gone up in some command center, but if so, it was short-lived. As the smoke settled, the reality of this victory became clear. Vraks was utterly ravaged. Those gigantic munition stockpiles, depleted or destroyed. The great citadel, half ruined and corrupted by warp energies. The very ground of Vraks was poisoned from chemicals and saturated with unholy residue. The air was choked with ash, and the infrastructure, mines, factories, depots, either collapsed from bombing or tainted beyond use. In effect, the Imperium had won a haunted graveyard. The original goal of securing valuable armaments was moot. They'd expended far more ordnance in the war than the planet ever held, and no one in their right mind would trust any shells or weapons left on Vraks now anyway. Who knows what kind of chaos taint lingered on them? The Inquisition declared Vraks Prime Perdita, meaning lost, a world too far gone to be worth rebuilding or resettling, and possibly still harboring chaos contamination. They placed the planet under permanent interdiction. No unauthorized personnel could ever go there under pain of death. Essentially, they quarantined the entire world. Teams of Ordo Malleus specialists would remain behind to scour for any remaining warp anomalies or demonic presence, and to study exactly how things had gotten so out of hand. The ruins of the Citadel would be picked over for any forbidden artifacts to be secured or destroyed. The surviving prisoners would be meticulously interrogated for any scraps of intel, then executed. Vraks itself would sit abandoned, a scar on Imperial space, perhaps occasionally visited by the Inquisition for a progress check, but largely left to rot. There was a bitter irony in all of this that likely wasn't lost on the veterans of the campaign. The Imperium essentially did to Vraks what they sought to prevent chaos from doing. They completely ruined it. They had to in order to save it. "We had to destroy the world to save the world" is not an official Imperial slogan, but it certainly could apply here. Sure, Cardinal Xaphan's grand rebellion was crushed. His name would go down in infamy, not triumph. Chaos didn't keep the armory, nor did it turn Vraks into some forward base for further crusades of heresy. In that sense, the Imperium succeeded in containing the threat. The lesson of Vraks, however, is one the Imperium faces again and again. A victory can be so costly that it feels indistinguishable from defeat. Hector Rex and what was left of the 88th Siege Army departed Vraks once their purging was done, leaving behind a silent rock filled with ghosts, figurative and possibly literal. The war was over, but its repercussions would linger. The High Lords had their example to point to. See what happens to traitors and the price we must pay to deal with them. A cautionary tale to any other would-be rebel lords. Meanwhile, the Death Korps of Krieg tallied their dead and considered their debt to the Emperor paid a little more. For them, such a bloody campaign is almost a spiritual atonement, as morbid as that is. The Grey Knights and Inquisition compiled reports on the Chaos Incursion, doubtless refining their grimoires for future confrontations with similar demonic war scenarios. And the Dark Angels? They slunk away with Arcos in custody to interrogate him in the depths of the rock, their mobile fortress monastery. What secrets he yielded, if any, are unknown to the wider Imperium. Perhaps in some dank cell, Arcos' screams joined those of other captured fallen as the Unforgiven carried on their shadow war. The Siege of Vraks remains one of the most infamous and exhaustively chronicled conflicts in Imperial history. It has since been cited in Tactica briefs as the exemplar of a meat grinder siege, what to do and what not to do. It's a story of zealotry, both the Cardinal's fanatical uprising and the Imperium's fanatical response. It's a story of unthinkable sacrifice, of siege lines that did not move for years while millions died, of heroes stepping up when nightmares were unleashed, and yes, of the darkness of chaos that ever waits to exploit the ambition and folly of man. In the end, was it worth it? Vraks was denied to the enemy. That's a win on the grand strategic scale. The Imperium can't afford an armory world in the hands of heretics. But the Imperium also effectively razed one of its own vital worlds in the process of saving it, and expended armies that could have been fighting Xenos or other threats elsewhere. It's the kind of victory only the grim calculus of the Imperium would consider acceptable. As the last ships left the Vraks system, an administratum scribe closed the official campaign ledger with a heavy thud, stamping it with the classification Pyrrhic Victory, Strategic Objective Achieved. The records note that the war lasted 17 years from initial landings to final cleanup, but for those who lived through it, it must have felt like an eternity of hell. The Siege of Vraks stands as a testament to the Imperial creed that no matter the cost, no matter how obscene the sacrifice, the enemies of the Emperor will be brought low. It's a victory, yes, but one so costly and drenched in bitter irony that one might wonder how many more victories like it the Imperium can endure. In the end, Vraks was nothing more than a tomb for the millions who died there, and a tomb for the grand ambitions of a deluded cardinal. The Imperium prevailed, but at a price that should give even the most hardened Imperial commander pause. Such is the way of the 41st millennium. Victories are often only slightly better than defeats, and yet, despite it all, humanity fights on, one horrific war at a time, in the hope that somehow, someday, the blood they spill will have been worth it.